Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here for this episode of the 2021 National Issues webinar series. Today we have the National Asset Leadership Strategy presented with Grant Thornton. And just before we get underway, I would like to thank the ALN organizational members as well as our patron sponsors, ABS Quality Evaluations and Onuma System. And one more big thanks to the Andrew James Advisory Group. They are sponsoring the upcoming video production and podcast. All of these episodes are made into videos and podcasts, so you can find them to listen, watch, or share with people that need to hear this stuff. Thank you again to the Andrew James Advisory Group, and I'll play a short 30-second video from them. Okay, and one final note before we get underway, if you're out there watching, we'd love to hear from you. So put any comments or questions you have in the chat or the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar. And with that, Jim Dieter, CEO of the Asset Leadership Network.
Hey, welcome. Thanks, Nick. And thanks for everyone joining us today and in the future. I want to thank first Mike Bordenaro for initiating and running this webinar series. So thanks very much, Mike. Today we'll be talking about the National Asset Leadership Strategy. And we're have a great panel that's been heavily involved in this, along with many others, over the last couple of years in developing this National Asset Leadership Strategy, or NALS, as we call it in shorthand. But we have Jack Kelly, also from the ALN, formerly of OMB, and several folks from Grant Thornton, who is an amazing part of the Asset Leadership Network. We have Moshe Nelson, Jon Schneider, and Ed Safdie. So welcome, gentlemen, today. And you'll be hearing from all of them. Importantly, at the end, we're definitely, overall, we're looking to get more people involved in this effort. There's more to do, and there's more ways to make a difference. So we're looking for your input and feedback. So please stay on with us. As Nick said, put questions in the chat or the question box, but also stay on, and we'll get to those questions at the towards the end of the hour, last 10 or 15 minutes. So looking forward to the discussion. So thanks again. John, you want to bring up our slides? Great, thanks. Yep, so NALS, National Asset Leadership Strategy, and then just briefly, the next slide is the agenda that we'll be going through and talking to. Moshe will talk a little bit about NALS development and background. John's going to talk about some of the highlights of NALS, not really to give you into the details of it by any stretch, but it is available on our website. So please go to assetleadership.net and check it out. The SALs are the sector asset leadership strategies. So we talk about background and examples and the impacts of those. And Jack Kelly and Ed Safdie will be doing that. Bring it back to, I'll lead a discussion about the overall impact of NALS. And then we'll, from there, open it up to your questions and comments and feedback. So with that, I have the honor to turn it over to Moshe Nelson from Grant Thornton.
All right, Jim. Hey, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for tuning in to another great ALN webinar on the National Asset Leadership Strategy. So I am Moshe Nelson. I'm a principal with Grant Thornton. I oversee our asset and supply chain management capability in the public sector and have been involved with ALN for more than 2 years. We started this effort, I would say a little over 2 years ago, after one of ALN's great annual conferences, and a large focus on ISO 55000 implementation within the United States. And at the time, we realized that there was a need to try to bring together actors to define how we were going to implement ISO 55000 and what benefits it can be achieved for the federal government, for state and local governments, for the commercial sector, given its use internationally and positive benefits that can be expected. Some of them, namely here, better asset management investment decisions, really managed risk, bottom line is providing more value to organizations in how they achieve their objectives through asset management. Some significant emphasis around social responsibility, particularly after what we've seen over the past year, in addition to some of the more tactical benefits around lifecycle asset management and organizational sustainability and efficiencies. You want to go to the next slide? All right. When we set up the working group for the NALs about 2 years ago, we had representatives from state and local, federal, commercial entities. And what we essentially did was tackle the national asset leadership strategy from these 6 particular areas: defining the objectives, the taxonomy of asset management, identifying what relevant stakeholders are relevant to these parties, the scope that should be included, which was a significant effort to focus effectively, and then ultimately what the objectives of these of the initiative of ISO 55000 and asset management would be, and then systems that need to come together to fulfill those objectives. I could say, serendipitously, as we have seen the impacts of COVID, the impacts of large, social unrest throughout the United States as well as globally, some of the framework that has been established and looking at assets as a system to be able to address many of society's needs, whether it be healthcare, commerce, or social benefit programs, essentially have somewhat come to fruition. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jon so that he can highlight on these 6 particular areas, and then we can go into other aspects of where the NALs has evolved since then. Jon?
Yeah, thanks, Moshe. Yeah, so as Moshe said, I'm Jon Schneider, a manager within Grant Thornton's Asset Management Solution Team. Been working with ALN, Moshe, and Ed here for about a year or so now on different iterations of the NALs. And so, like Moshe said, I'm going to walk you through at a high level these different categories and talk through, what we've included in the document there as well. So without further ado, I'll go to the first section here. So what we started with is really at the high level and to lay out what are the national objectives. And so really categorize those into 5 different categories of security, environment, economy, communities, and leadership. And in this graphic here on the screen, you can see a few of those detailed objectives we laid out within those different categories. And so, like I said, we really wanted to start at this high level, identify what are those key objectives that an asset management strategy would roll up to at the national level, and really frame the discussion on asset management. Because really, once you know what the national goals are, you can start identifying the different types of assets that you need to accomplish that goals. So really wanted to start at that high level and look at, what are the objectives of the nation. And once really you have that identified, wanting to move into, what do we mean when we talk about assets? And so at the top of the screen here, you have the ISO definition of of an asset, and that is an item, a thing, or entity that has an actual or potential value to an organization. And so when developing the National Asset Leadership Strategy, the NALS, really we require an agreement on the different characteristics or the qualities that describe the nation's asset. So a taxonomy, in our view, does as well, is based on the innate characteristics of the assets and not on the ownership or the use, the cost, or other factors of the asset. And so looking at the graphic on your screen, form is really the highest level of the taxonomy that we laid out and breaks out the organization's assets into a physical or non-physical category. Those physical assets are broken down into what we traditionally talk about as assets, constructed assets, or natural resources. The non-physical assets are virtual assets, networks, data, software, and the conceptual assets could even be the management and control systems of an organization. And so what the goal here is to have that common language and that common way to speak about assets and understand how to categorize those at a high level. And so, now in a document, and what we've done now is identify those national objectives, identify how to really speak about the assets within the organization. We wanted to then move into, who are the stakeholders and what individuals have an interest in NALS and an interest in the nation's assets. So I can see here again, we've included the ISO 5000 definition of a stakeholder, and it's quite vague, or broad, I should say, is that it is a person or organization that can affect, be affected, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity, and in this case, a decision or activity involving the management of the nation's assets. So from the perspective of developing a national strategy, we group stakeholders in two different ways. First, you can see on the left is the public sector, and the right, you have the private sector stakeholders. And within those, you really have two broader categories, the asset owners and operators and the influencers. And so when talking about the asset owners or operators on the public sector side, that is your federal agencies, your state agencies, your local governments, those are the ones that are directly managing the assets. They're making the decisions. The other stakeholders in the public sector space, be the public even, or in the private sector space, be investors and the media. Those are the ones that are really going to be influenced by the actions of those individuals. So wanted to be broad and ensure that we were looking at all the different players that are impacted by asset management strategy. And really is that stakeholders inform the objectives of the nation, and they inform how the assets are used to accomplish those objectives that we talked about a few slides ago. So now that we've identified the objectives, the national objectives, a taxonomy, how to speak about assets, the stakeholders who are going to be interested and involved in the national strategy, we want to talk about the scope and what are the assets that are actually included in the NALS, in the National Asset Leadership Strategy. And so at a high level, national assets are defined as assets that support objectives that we've highlighted earlier, and they can include all different forms or domains, classifications that we talked about in the taxonomy slide, and wanted to break it into three high-level groups. And that is, you have federal assets, so you have assets that are owned and operated by the federal government. You have state and municipal assets, so those are owned by the state or managed by the state and local governments. And then you have private assets, which are those are impacted by the government actions or policies or regulations. And really what we wanted to do is to ensure that a NALS, the national strategy, includes all these categories and is really robust enough to include all the different stakeholders and the scope of assets that might be impacted by the national strategy. So now that we've kind of laid out the scope of what's included in the NALS, we wanted to put a little thought into what are the considerations regarding assets that are important to achieving these national goals and objectives. And so what we call these are the asset management objectives. And so asset management objectives address the performance of the nation's assets, the scope that are included in the strategy, that work to accomplish the goals of the nation, the national objectives. So really, I think the important thing we wanted to highlight here is, in the absence of an enduring asset management objective or objectives, typical objectives tend to be based on near-term political demands. And so having a national asset leadership strategy, having a long-term vision is important to provide that direction for the strategy for the national assets that we've talked about, while also leaving some room for short-term decisions that need to take place. So on the screen here, we included a few different potential objectives that can be defined as an asset management objectives. Sustainability, predictability, cost effectiveness, affordability, accessibility. So those are the things that we look at as being, these are the goals of an asset management program that help achieve the broader national objectives we talked about a few slides ago. And so the last thing I wanted to highlight is an effective asset management system. And so these are really how the system and the program that an organization can use to really put into practice the preceding 5 or 6 slides that we've talked through. And so to date, we are obviously aware that asset management fundamentals have been applied across the government in some instances at the federal level, the state level, local level, or private sector. But at this point, these fundamentals have not really been applied at the policy level. And so we think that a national asset leadership strategy is a great opportunity to do that and to improve the value of the assets of the federal government and different stakeholders, and ensure that they're being managed in a responsible way. And I think what we do is really benefit from is a existing publicly available set of requirements for effective asset management throughout the ISO 55001 standards. And so that is really the highlights of the nows and the different categories we have. And I'll close with just a last comment and say, we really wanted to, as we've developed this iteration of the nows this year, is to provide that framework and understanding, with COVID and other budgetary constraints, the need for efficient and effective asset management is a high priority now more than ever. And so what we wanted to do with this national asset leadership strategy is provide that higher level overview, really set the stage for a national strategy for asset management, and provide the framework for a more granular, specific, detailed plans for a specific sector. And so I'm going to hand off to Jack to talk a little bit about how we took this national strategy and put it into more of a sector-specific frame.
Thanks, John. As I'm listening to this presentation, I realized that we've been involved in this for a long time, and we're all pretty well familiar with ISO 55000 and what it says and what it does. And a lot of people who are listening to this who are familiar with ISO 55000 are going to find the terms that we're using very familiar, because these are concepts and principles that come right out of the standard. Those of you who aren't familiar with ISO 55000 may look at it and say, well, these things make a whole lot of sense. And they do, because the standard basically is a collection of a lot of good sense. So another point I think I want to emphasize about the standard is the standard itself was designed for individual organizations. It was designed to, for a given government agency, for example, and the government agency looks at what its objectives are and what its assets are, and all these kinds of questions that we've raised here, these 6 elements, if you will, are all important things for any organization to consider. But when you're thinking about a nation is a whole collection of stuff. It's not just one organization, it's a whole lot of organizations. And so the challenge we faced with putting together this national asset leadership strategy is, how do we take the principles of ISO 55000 and apply them nationwide? And some of the ways we did that, you've just heard from Moshe and John, in terms of looking at the nation's assets, creating a taxonomy so we can talk about national assets in a consistent way. All these things are important when you're talking about applying an organization-focused standard, if you will, to a collection of organizations. So once we got to this point, we started thinking, okay, so now that we think we have these basic principles down pretty solid. They make a whole lot of sense to us. What do we do now? And so as we were thinking about taking the foundational elements of the National Asset Leadership Strategy and turning it into an implementation strategy, we took a closer look at the stakeholders. We looked at the asset owners and operators, because they all, that's who, those are the people whose behavior we want to change. I mean, those are the people whom we want to implement effective asset management systems so that they become more effective in accomplishing their missions. So they're really the main target audience for what we're doing. But then you look at the influencers, and the influencers are all over the map. They range, like in the federal government, you've got congressional committees, subcommittees, you've got oversight agencies like OMB and GAO and CBO and others. You've got and the private, you've got regulatory agencies that affect not only government agencies, but also private sector agencies. So there are a lot of different players that influence the asset owners and operators. And so when you think about how you want to engage those, it turns out that they naturally fall into sectors. So if you think about the economy, you've got, in fact, that's the way we normally talk about the country. We say infrastructure sectors. So it's energy sector, transportation sector. And it turns out that each sector has its own unique set of organizations that are asset owners and operators. They kind of cluster according to sector. You also, on the influencer side, you have influencers that cluster by sector. You have congressional committees and subcommittees that focus on specific sectors. You have professional associations, some of whom cut across sectors, others who focus narrowly on sectors. And so the sector-based approach seemed to us to be the most promising path forward. And so what we did is we put together a sector asset leadership strategy. And one of the components of that strategy that's extremely important is collecting information about each sector so that we can map a path forward. Each sector is going to have different characteristics, and some of those characteristics are going to provide opportunities, because we're going to find organizations in certain sectors that have already embraced ISO 55000. Some may have been certified to it, others haven't been certified, but they've adopted it. So they're voices of experience in applying this standard to within their sector. You've got other organizations. In fact, when you think around the world, a lot of countries have focused on specific sectors, and they've actually required the use of ISO 55000 by organizations in the sector, because those sectors are considered part of their critical national infrastructure. That then generally applies to water, wastewater, it applies to energy, sometimes applies to transportation. It just depends on the country. We haven't done that in this country yet, but maybe that's something that could evolve from what we're trying to do here. But anyway, I want to now turn it over to Ed Safdie. Ed is someone who comes out of the healthcare sector. He's very knowledgeable in that sector, and he's actually developed, he's kind of followed along the path that we've laid out and started putting together some really important pieces of information about his sector. So Ed, take it away.
Thanks, Jack. And John, if you could bring up the slides that we had and go to slide 11. Perfect. The group that's on the panel for this call and others started with a blank sheet of paper, and we had several robust working sessions to develop the potential questions to ask for a SALS, a sector asset leadership structure. We put them into groups, and I briefly want to go through them here. After going through them here for 10,000 foot level, we're going to skip into the actual SALS paper for healthcare infrastructure and show you what the first sample of a SALS looks like. So here we go. First, we want to define the sector, just exactly what is it that we're going to address. And I'm going to say this again when we get to the paper, but it's really important to define the sector and what assets are included in the sector. And I'll explain why that's important when we get to the paper. What is the current state of your sector? If you're familiar with the American Society of Civil Engineers, I believe our grade for the national infrastructure, which has, I think, 19 or so categories, went from a D+ to a C-. There are issues to be addressed, and you will see that all the sectors can and do affect the healthcare infrastructure sector. And by that, I mean real property, the actual physical infrastructure for healthcare. What are the boundaries? What regulations are involved? For those of you who've worked in healthcare, you heard of TJC, and that's something that we all have to comply with, even though it's voluntary, or the entity in question won't be able to receive third-party funding. But that's just the beginning. You will see when we get to the paper that there are manifold regulations, laws, and other best practices that are not required to follow. The sector objectives, well, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Safe roads, clean water, exactly what are we trying to accomplish? And what are the categories of assets within the sector that are going to be included in our SALs? Can we go to the next slide, John? This one's, excuse me, this one's really important, the stakeholders. I do recall that we had long discussions about stakeholders, and that influencers, as Jack mentioned, are one of the components of stakeholder. Absolutely critical, because the influencers can change the working lives of those who try to manage assets in the infrastructure. And here it becomes critically important for advocacy. That is something where the ALN is heavily engaged. And what are the objectives? What are we trying to accomplish? Let's define it. For those familiar with A55K, with ISO 55001, metrics are important, and it's important that they're achievable. What management systems are going to be put into place to manage the sector, the assets in the sector? And here's another one. A cold light of morning look at what obstacles are in the way to achieve the objectives that have been defined. And for compliance, how or will the sector or the organization building an asset management system comply or choose to comply with A55K? And what are the benefits? You've heard part of that in the earlier portions of our presentation. So that's a big picture, a 10,000 view look at the pictures the questions we developed. And John, if you could bring up the paper. This, is it possible to make the print a little bit bigger? Great, great. You see the date there. We developed this in November of 2020, and you can't see it yet, but it's already changed. It's being improved. And I would like to say on the first round, principally from lots of excellent comments from Jack Kelly, who's also on this call. Jack read everything that I wrote and came back with feedback. So we're going to try to implement most of those in the next round. And can I just say, I joined Grant Thornton 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, and Moshe quickly introduced me to the ALN as soon as I got here. I came here after a career in engineering of almost 4 decades working in healthcare. So I developed this paper from the lens of someone who started in the bowels of the medical center, maintaining systems and equipment, up to the executive suite. So while I had a full picture, a full spectrum view of healthcare infrastructure, I'm just one person. This is just a draft, and we need other SMEs to contribute. We welcome feedback at any time, and you can contact any of us to do so. We look forward to that. So I want to emphasize, this is just a beginning. And we can scroll down to, I've mentioned that the content is dynamic. We can scroll down to page 2, John, where the titles are Pressing Problems and Strengths. Here we go. I'd like to talk a little bit about pressing problems right there in the infrastructure. It's aged. The aged infrastructure might apply more to some entities than others, but it's aged. And as we all know, and especially Jack knows, having worked in OMB, it is a challenge, if not a fight, to get adequate funding for sustainment for recapitalization, for maintenance and repair. So it is a huge challenge in the field for those of us that have been on the front line where the delivery of healthcare takes place. Just one example, the electrical grid infrastructure in the nation is not in great shape, and that has a direct effect on the management and efficacy of providing healthcare in medical centers. They have to be prepared. They have to be prepared, and they have to be prepared with potable water as well. I've experienced both of those in the field from earthquakes and hurricanes. You just don't know when it's going to go down, and you have to be ready. Inadequate capital funding, that's another huge challenge. We have to plan ahead, we have to make realistic goals, and we have to prioritize. So this is a constant challenge for those of us working in the field to get these things done. And rapid technological improvements. In the last decade, I would say, it's become a much bigger challenge hiring qualified staff to maintain facilities. The advent of first microprocessors and then far more advanced computing systems means that they're great. They help us get our work done, but it means that it requires special training to maintain them. That goes for building systems, patient record management, etc. In this case, it's the building systems that we're concerned with. I found that toward the end of my career, we were doing a lot more contracted support and unable to hire the staff that we needed for varying reasons, but there was a lot more contracted support. And you can scroll down just a little bit, John. What are the strengths of the sectors? And despite these challenges, I have seen through those decades of work that the leaders and staff who work out there are dedicated. That is a main strength. In fact, I'd go so far to say as it's a mainstay. One side discussion that we've been having is something that some of us would advocate for, and that is for the ASCE to start giving a grade to the healthcare infrastructure. This is where we care for our most vulnerable citizens and others, and I believe it merits consideration. Looking at that next sector, the ASCE score for infrastructure, if you could scroll down just a little bit, John. Yes, too much. Thank you. There are campuses like, say, a Stanford or a UCLA where there are healthcare facilities in a campus. They're miniature cities. There are many that come to mind in the Department of Veterans Affairs where I worked, like in Hines or Palo Alto or Los Angeles. These are miniature cities. If the overall grade for the infrastructure is a D+ or a C-, and all those sectors can affect the healthcare facility infrastructure, we need to pay attention to all of that. There are manifold reports that are out there that highlight these challenges. The average grid circuit is 40 years old, some cases as old as 100. There's no real-time monitoring. The controls for them are written in a language from the 1950s. The picture becomes clear. That is why we have to be so well prepared. Can we scroll down just a little bit, John? Oh, yes, the impact of electric vehicles on the grid for the nation as a whole is going to be substantial. It'll be the equivalent of a commercial building moving around and reconnecting to the grid, drawing power. Today, the average utility can collect 60 million annual data points for 5 million customers and a dozen annual bills. In the future, it may have to collect up to 5 billion data points. All these things can have a cascading effect on the healthcare infrastructure. Then we talk about laws and regulations. Just what laws and regulations impact the sector? So if you scroll down just a little bit, John, you're going to see a bunch of bullets there. I'd like to hold on that one about the Joint Commission. Can you scroll back up to the paragraph, please? Joint Commission is key. Those that haven't worked in healthcare may have never heard of it, and this was an interesting topic of discussion for our group as we developed this. As I said previously, while it's voluntary, passing the TJC is essential to achieving third-party accreditation for funding, for reimbursement. The revocation of accreditation is a disaster. And what does one have to do? What does the entity have to do to pass a Joint Commission survey, which occurs unannounced every 2 years? 250 standards across a spectrum of services in the medical center. So one quickly gets the idea of the challenge, and that's just the beginning. What about NFPA and all 99, 101, 70, all the codes comprised in the NFPA? Those each require experts to be able to comply. What about OSHA and the National Historic Preservation Act? And if we scroll down, John, there's a few more. I'm not going to name all of them, but NEPA, excuse me, NEPA and ANSI standards. A lot of the standards that you see that come after that apply to federal entities, but they have cascading effects on private industry as well. So there's so much to know, so much to learn to be able to comply and maintain the infrastructure. Could we go to page 3, John, where it says boundaries? Here we go. I mentioned those boundaries. The ones that you see in italics on the list of other sectors are the ones that can most deeply affect the healthcare infrastructure. I've already talked about those a little bit, so I'm not going to go into further detail. Suffice to say, the healthcare infrastructure is dependent upon and can be influenced by the other sectors. And page 5, John, I'd like to skip to stakeholders. There we go. This topic brought about more robust discussion among our groups as we spoke together and built the list of all the stakeholders for the healthcare infrastructure. Take one look at that and see the expanse and how each stakeholder has a different effect or influence upon the healthcare infrastructure. It is a complex undertaking to advocate, to implement laws and regulations that are reasonable and that can be met, and to care for our patients, which is the cardinal goal for the infrastructure, to provide safe and efficacious healthcare. And I'll go down to the bottom, page 7, voluntary standards to close before turning it back to Jack. There it is. These are things that the healthcare infrastructure managers and leaders don't necessarily have to comply with, but are helpful. We've mentioned ISO 55000, less known as the 41001 standard for facility management. ISO 9001 for quality management is prevalent in healthcare industry now, especially in sterile processing. Construction Industry Institute, constant construction projects in a medical center, improving, adding, sustaining, modifying. There are all these professional standards and guides that need, well, I couldn't say need, but that the entities and the sector should become familiar with to perform at its peak. That's a picture of what a SALS looks like. I will close by saying this is just a beginning. We intend to improve on this as time goes forward, and we welcome your feedback at any time. Jack, it's all yours.
Thanks, Ed. And so Ed gave an excellent overview of just how complex these sector-based approaches are. There are just a lot of things you have to consider within that are unique to a sector that affect how you approach the influencers in that sector, and you help the influencers approach the asset owners and operators. And in some cases, you may just want to approach the asset owners and operators directly. So it is the kind of enterprise that requires very specialized knowledge. Ed brings that kind of knowledge from the healthcare sector, and he's intersected with a lot of the other sectors, like, you know, the water sector and the energy sector and so forth. But what we are looking to do is to build teams of people around experts like Ed in the different sectors that we want to engage in. We want those folks to help us understand the unique aspects of each of the sectors with which they're familiar, and to help us map a path forward on how we can be understanding of those unique aspects, and then figure out where the opportunities are, where the barriers are to actually mobilizing people to implement ISO 55000. One of the things I will say, and when I was listening to Ed, I mean, it sounds kind of overwhelming, all the things that people have to consider. The nice thing about ISO 55000 is it helps organizations set up management structures that consider them as just a matter of course. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jim and let Jim talk about the overall NAL's thinking at this point in time. Jim?
Great, thanks. Wow, that was awesome. That was really good. Good job of going through those concepts, guys. So we've talked a lot of detail, and there's obviously much more. We could have spent a lot of time on all of these, but what is the impact of this? What impact has it had? What impact can it have? What impact should it have? Which I guess is just another version of those of us involved in asset leadership of how do you make the business case for this? How do you make the case that organizations should start doing this? So when I think, it's great to have all this information, but then you find yourself talking to a staffer on Capitol Hill, and if what you're handing them has more than one page, their eyes start to roll, right? So there's how do you prune it down to that? And I would say, from the start on this, my one line has been, we talk about crumbling infrastructure problems, rebuilding America, whatever. But when you focus on the way it's been, we need to say, we can't let this happen again. It's a huge decision and discussion to invest and make decisions about investing. But that investment needs to come with appropriations or accommodations to support this infrastructure for the life of the asset. Otherwise, we're going to be right back where we are with crumbling bridges. And we all know that crumbling bridges or deteriorating hospitals or tunnels that are 150 years old aren't the fault of the people operating the assets or maintaining the assets. They're the fault of policy and decision makers and the pressures on them. They're shareholders, perhaps more than stakeholders sometimes, but stakeholders in the government policy perspective are answering to that short-term objective of what's this year's budget. Not when we talk about this infrastructure bill, it needs to be what's the life cycle cost of these assets and how are those costs going to be addressed? I mean, it has to, it just has to, because we can't build stuff to let it crumble again. It is just wrong in so many ways. So that's my speech. Let me first kick it back to Moshe. Moshe, do you have what are your thoughts on the impact of the NALs and the cells and how can this play?
Sure, and Jim, I want to add to something that you talked about. I think that I like to paint this in a little more a positive, opportunistic note for ISO 55000, and quite frankly, the dynamic that has changed due to the proliferation of greater accountability through greater communication as well as data, right? I think what the paradigm has shifted considerably over the past 20 years in that you're getting faster information on the success or failure of infrastructure and how that is related back to the mission of particular agencies, state and local government, even the private sector. So I think we have a great opportunity here to, with the NALs, you establish the vision and establish a high-level strategy, creating that framework. And then ultimately, as we've been executing it, refining and identifying opportunities to make ISO 55000 a standard that brings value for these various industries. And healthcare was obviously a great example that Ed has pulled out. When we have our law enforcement asset management SALs kicking off, and a lot of participation as well. So I think we're going to see the evolution of the standard being applied as more users adopt it, as well as the feedback that is received from users that have adopted principles versus those who have not. So that's my 2 cents on what we've done to date, how the paradigm has shifted due to greater technology and data availability, as well as news travels much faster. So actions can also be taken as a result.
Good.
I'd like to add one thought, and this.
Sure, Jack, go ahead.
This is something that hits me all the time when we talk about infrastructure. Most of the conversation that occurs in Washington about infrastructure is how much money can we raise and who's going to put the money on the table. Those are the 2 main questions. What people are missing is the fact that if organizations implement this asset management standard effectively, they're going to get a whole lot more bang from the bucks they currently have. And they're going to be able to make better decisions on getting better outcomes with the resources they have. So we don't have to wait to get a lot of new money. People can start right now paying attention to improving the way they manage their assets, and they get more value out of the assets they currently have. And in part of that process, they start freeing up resources to help them, achieve more value across a wider portfolio. Some of our federal government partners that we work with, like the Air Force and others, have experienced this and have wonderful stories to tell about how they've been able to reprioritize their maintenance and reprioritize their investments in ways that focus on mission first and condition second. And so by doing that, they're able to free up resources within the base monies that they have right now. And that's huge. And that's not a message that we hear very often.
John, you have thoughts to share?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah, I think what we talked about a lot with this iteration and updating the nows is, we spent a lot of time developing the framework and the ideas and laying out those different categories I walked through. But I think the real value and the kind of the exciting part that you're kind of moving towards is what Ed talked about, is the healthcare and SALs and developing the detailed and more kind of granular look at a different sector. And so, yeah, as Moshe said, we're working on the law enforcement SALs and excited to see where that takes us. And I think that's really where we can implement all the different ideas and notions we talk about at the high level in the now. So,
Ed, who is the target for this healthcare SALs? Who do you hope to get this in front of?
To begin with, facility managers, but far beyond that, I think the COOs and CEOs of healthcare infrastructure, of medical centers, live-in homes, all the entities where healthcare is provided, they all have an interest. It's not just a medical center, it's an outpatient clinic, and it's not just SMEs, because part of the job for the SMEs is to persuade executive leadership what needs to be done. And Jim, on that note, I want to tag on something both Jack and Moshe touched upon. First of all, Jack is absolutely right. We can't just throw money at the problem. And we've had our own internal robust discussions about that. It's not that simple. And Moshe's right too. There is an opportunity beyond the challenge. So Jim, what I'd like to say is, let's persuade by example. Look what University Medical Center did in San Antonio with Art Kurland addressing personal property, otherwise known as equipment. Look what they accomplished. I don't have the metrics in front of me, but they have proven that money can be saved, service can be improved, and that there's a service to the community, because I know that they have ended up donating a huge tranche of equipment that otherwise might just be sitting there. That is a success story for advertisement. So I'd like to see the SALs for healthcare get in front of facility managers, healthcare engineers, COOs, CEOs. All those people should be pitching in. It's just a draft. It's dynamic, and it's never going to stop being improved.
So I think it was Steve asked a question, Steve Holland, about the NALS, about the National Asset Leadership Strategy or structure. So can this really be adopted by the federal government? Who are we trying to get that in front of? Who are our targets for this document? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Sure. So it's in theory, it's OMB basically is the organization within the executive office of president that helps form, national federal policies on various management things and budget things and so forth. And so I wish I were back there, because I think that would be the ideal position to be in. The problem is that OMB's got a lot on its plate, and getting folks at OMB to understand the value of this. And Jim, you and I have been in meetings with a lot of these folks, and getting them to see this as a path forward to accomplishing something that's important to them has been a challenge. Again, I cannot overestimate or overstate just how much work is laid on these folks, and the same is on congressional staffers. I mean, they've got way more things to do than there is reasonable amount of time to do it in. So it's just hard to get their attention. So going back to your question, I think working with agencies as we have already done, and helping explain within clusters of agencies or doing similar things, like the power marketing administrations under the Department of Energy. You've got the Western Area Power Administration is far along in implementing ISO 55000. I understand from them that the Bonneville Power Administration is also far along in that. And these are world-class organizations that are implementing the standard in a way that's unusual within the federal government. That story needs to be shared more broadly within the federal government, and the benefits of using ISO 55000 based asset management system is available to any agency that wants to adopt it. And the agencies that have adopted it can give great stories about the benefits they've achieved and their real world. And so it's not like, making things up. It's not, making promises you can't meet. These are promises that have been made and kept. And so those sorts of stories need to be shared more broadly. I think the ALN does a pretty good job of that, but I think we can up our game.
I also want to mention that we've had ongoing conversations with the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Senators de Blasio and Graves, depending on who's in power, have been leading that. And it's a largely bipartisan organization. They have some rhetoric, but they tend to work together to complete infrastructure projects. And, in my involvement working on the NALS, I always sort of thought of them, it's like, well, here's a plan, they were, and it's really hard to believe, but you can see how it could happen in that they make all these big decisions, but do they really have an overall plan of what we're trying to accomplish with infrastructure? And as Jack has said and others have said, there's various committees working on this. Probably the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has the biggest hunk because they have pipelines and roads and rail and tunnels and ports and lots of things. But it's hard to have this overall view of it. In fact, if you look at our NALS document, we have those national objectives. Well, we had to kind of make those up because we don't have national objectives. It's an interesting concept. Let's see, Mike had suggested we might want to address Biden's executive order addressing equity and how that might apply to nows and to infrastructure. Anybody want to talk to that a bit?
Yeah, I'll jump in for a second, and anybody else can jump in too. One of the things, for folks that have been following the ALN for a while, they know that we host a series of discussions on Thursday at 4, and we also have other topics that have been discussed at this time slot on Tuesdays. And we had one from a working group that I don't know what we call it, but essentially it's what Cecilia Mowat and some of her colleagues have put together, our equity group. And it's all about making sure that let me say this differently. One of the keys to bringing equity conversations into asset management conversations is making sure that you broaden the group of stakeholders and bring into the conversation people that may not have been brought into previous conversations. It's folks that have been marginalized, people just didn't think about them, they didn't pay attention, whatever it is, but value is in the eye of stakeholders. And so if you broaden the stakeholders that you bring into the asset management conversation, and you ask the right questions and you listen to their answers and you help get them to help ask the right questions, then you start really thinking about equity in a much more inclusive way, and a way that actually can affect decisions. And that's what I think most of us these days are trying to make happen.
Yeah, I think one other point is the NOWs or ISO 55000's role in enabling change, right? We have a new administration. There's a lot of change going on in government, a lot of new ambitious goals that have been set out there. So, how can we apply the framework of the NOWs, the framework of ISO 55000, to create the mechanism for such change? And I would argue that a lot of the accountability that's driven out of the measurement that is prescribed in ISO 55000 creates an environment where individuals can see what performance or stakeholders are involved in the entire process, and find a medium to get to become integrated into the asset management objectives writ large. So I think 55000 has a major role in enabling significant change and the achievement of ambitious goals by creating that entire framework from which to operate. And I would even point to global pandemics and national disasters as examples where there are entities that have implemented ISO 55000 principles and could more effectively address changes that were necessary to deal with large pandemic issues. So, I don't want to overlook the framework and the strategic principles that ISO 55000 and the NALS tries to set out to achieve.
Guys, it's been a great discussion, and I don't want to put an end to it, but we are coming up on the hour, and so I just want to quickly make sure I thank our sponsors again, ABS Quality Evaluations and Onuma Systems for their support, as well as other organizational members, and especially, again, the Andrew James Advisory Group, because they are sponsoring the video production and podcast. So if you liked what you heard here, or you think somebody else needs to see it, please share it along. And then one last quick plug for our Thursday at 4, we have Bill Garrett, this Thursday, Director, Personal Property Management and Policy at GSA. So I hope to see you all there. And with that, if you guys have a little more time, I think we had a few more questions.
Wanted to make one mention in talking about infrastructure. We haven't mentioned ALN Senior Fellow Marty Rowland, and has been the father of an ASTM standard about infrastructure that addresses infrastructure from a user perspective rather than a construction perspective. For a municipality, what systems are needed? You need education systems, you need healthcare systems, you need food systems, you need transportation systems, you need entertainment systems, and it's really worth checking out. And that sort of ties to a question that was asked about the ASCE scorecard, which is, back to our college grades, A through F, whatever. Do we think we need an A? Maybe that's our last question for the day. What grade do we need? Moshe, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, I guess that really depends on risk tolerance. So I will apply ISO 55000 principles and say that you have to define your risk tolerance for that asset class in order to determine which grade you should achieve based upon acceptable failure rates. So that's my maybe not punting the question, but at least the application of other methodologies to give you a good answer.
Yeah, good. Ed?
There was a question almost exactly like that asked in the chat, and I see that I failed to answer it to the questioner. I think I ended up sending it only to Mike, so apologies. I think Moshe is 100% correct, and I'll tell you the example I gave in my answer. Must everything be an A? The answer is, it depends. The pothole on an entry road into the medical center is not nearly as important as a failed, I should say, a vulnerable electrical distribution system within the medical center. One that has inadequate emergency electrical power, both in ampacity, KVA, and in distribution. That is a serious problem, and it's going to need a much higher grade than that pothole in the road. So it depends. And there are manifold factors to make that decision. That kind of goes into a hazard vulnerability assessment where a group of specialists, SMEs involved, would contribute to the decision.
Is that different than a criticality analysis, Ed?
Slightly
Or is it
different.
just another name?
No, it's different. It measures the probability of an event and the potential untoward result of the event. So those are the two principal factors that affect a hazard vulnerability analysis. And it's a common term in emergency management, but that's essentially what would happen here.
That's good. And we've had on past events, we've had really nice discussions. I had a conversation with Malik Marami, who's with the asset manager for the parks here in Fairfax County, where I live. And they have their criticality analysis, which I think sort of comes from the other side, as I understand it, includes the equity question too. So it's, do you fix the roads in the good neighborhoods, or do you fix the roads in the busiest neighborhoods, or do you fix the roads, where do you fix the roads, or the water pipes?
Jim, may I answer one more question that's in the chat?
Please, and then we'll wrap it up.
It's from Stephen. He wanted to know if the SALs could be shared, and he phrased it as Mr. Safdie's SALs. It's not mine. I just happen to be the one who volunteered to take the first crack at it. And I don't see why it couldn't be shared. I would ask if it's okay with Jim, if we can do that. And I'd ask Stephen if Jack and I can have a chance to update it first, because there are a lot of great suggestions to incorporate that we haven't had time to do so. Is that okay, Jim?
That's good. And if it isn't already posted on our website, I would suggest, I'm never in favor of waiting for better. I think we ought to post it now, and then we have a better one, post that. But
all good.
We'll leave it to you guys.
All good. Thanks.
And we have Nick online, and he's just the guy to do that for us. So that's good. Let's see. Any final words? Jack, any final words?
I guess one of the things about ISO 55000 is there's never a final word. There's always continuous improvement, right? So you can always do better, and you can always think more thoughts. The thing that I like the most about ISO 55000 and its approach to structuring an asset management system, or whatever you want to call it. It's a way of managing assets, but it's not just managing assets. It's a lot of people get that confused. They think of asset management and managing assets as synonymous, and they're not. Asset management is how an organization organizes itself at a very high level and from the top to the bottom to understand what its roles are, what its responsibilities are, and what its objectives are, and then understand how its assets contribute to accomplishing those objectives, and then what it needs to do to set specific measurable objectives, monitor performance against those, and then basically change behavior based on the results. So if you miss a target, that doesn't mean you just have to pack your bags and go home. That means you decide, you understand why you missed it. It may be because it was a wrong target. So it causes you to think about things that pop up when your performance deviates from what you want it to be. And then the lovely thing about ISO 55000 and that approach to asset management is that it gets the organization engaged at all relevant levels in making the decisions, making the plans, monitoring the results. It's not like a bunch of guys down in the engine room making sure the engines run. It's the whole organization understands, what the different components' roles are in doing the jobs that they're assigned to do so that the organization is ultimately successful.
Yeah, the Aussies are having a lot of conversations, as you know, wrapping that concept maybe with some, more external factors as well, and calling it adaptability as a key factor of an asset management system.
Yeah, and the thing that's been eye-opening in my conversations with them is that they make a distinction between ISO 55000, the way it's currently written, as a closed system, as opposed to what they are promoting, which is adding another fundamental of adaptability, which would require asset management systems to be open. And the difference is, so a closed system, in other words, you're mainly focused internally. Every once in a while, you come up with a new strategic plan, and in that process, you reach out to outside stakeholders, and other environmental factors. But then you kind of focus inward. You set objectives, you monitor objectives, and you make continuous improvement. What they're saying is that in a fast-changing world, where technology changes really quickly, the environment can change. You have a pandemic. You have things pop up that you haven't expected. They're not in your plan. Adaptability means having sensory apparatuses out there and people who are focused outward and saying, hey, we're 6 months into the year, but here's something that just hit that we hadn't planned for. We need to react to that. And it's being able to adapt to changing circumstances, both external circumstances and internal. You could have some kind of, the pandemic could have caused you to lose half your workforce, at least temporarily. So it's being able to react to changes, whether they're external or internal changes, and react successfully.
Well, I saw Jon dropped off, must have gotten kicked off, and he's back on. So Jon, any final thoughts or words you'd like to share?
Thank you. Yeah, benefit of teleworking, and my internet cut out there for about 10 minutes. So back on. Thank you. Happy we're able to talk today and share some more insight on the nows and the sows. We're working now on a law enforcement sector asset leadership strategy, and anyone's interested in supporting that, all volunteers are happily accepted. So looking forward to working on that, and working with ALN and those on the call today.
Thank you. Well, two things. I'd like to thank everyone on the panel today. I thought it was all very clearly presented. Very, very good. I think we all did a good job of presenting it. And then to reinforce what Jon just said, and the list of other sectors that Ed shared, which is of course only the beginning of the list of possible sectors. From an ALN perspective, we are, ready, willing, and able to support individuals, volunteers, and sponsors, organizations, willing to lead a sales effort or to formulate what Mike's been working on, sector boards that could have this as part of their mission, to work with partner organizations in that sector, as we're working with ASCE to some extent, as we work with Congress. So if people are interested in getting involved, please let us know, and we can tell you how we can help you be successful. and to achieve the overall goal that the ALN has, and I think we all have in our involvement here, is to look for those win-win-wins that mean better asset management in the United States and beyond, and success for our organizations, our customers, and professionally for ourselves, of course, too. So again, thanks to Ed Safdie, Jonathan Schneider, Jack Kelly, Moshe Nelson. Thanks to Nick Kanoki as our producer today, and especially thanks to Mike Bordenaro, who is slightly under the weather, who is the force behind this series of webinars, which has been excellent. So thank you all very much, and thanks to everybody that participated today, and look forward to see you the next time. Thanks.